is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Over the course of the last year, we've discussed the National Health Service many, many times. It's a political hot potato. Labour say keep throwing more money at it. The Tories in response say look at the way Labour's running the health service in Wales. And of course on Saturday there was a big protest outside Downing Street demanding more money for the health service. We've seen with a flu epidemic, not a big one, but a flu epidemic, we've seen a lot of operations put on hold. Waiting times are going up. And what I had to say about this today won't surprise any of you that are regular listeners, because you've heard it all before. The difference is this was a debate on Fox News on their morning breakfast show, and this is what I had to say. Well, the big problem we've got is a population crisis caused by government policy on immigration. So we, with a population of 65 million, are now increasing by 500,000 people every single year. Over 3/4 of that directly attributable to immigration over the last few years. And the problem is, we just haven't got enough hospitals. We haven't got enough doctors. We haven't got enough facilities. That's one problem we've got. Another big problem we've got is that the National Health Service has kind of moved into becoming the International Health Service. And we're providing a lot of health care for people coming into Britain from all over the world. So we do need some absolutely fundamental reforms. This system that we had was set up in 1948, and actually, surprisingly, for a state-run thing, for most of the first, certainly 50 years, the public had great faith in it. Right now, it's pretty much at breaking point. Okay, no surprises there. As I say, for regular listeners, I believe we have a population crisis. That is the NHS's big, big problem. I'm also very much on the record for saying that health tourism, frankly, the mickey's been taken out of us. And there are many, many other problems. What I hadn't expected was within a couple of minutes, President Trump had tweeted, "Thank you to Fox and Friends," that's the show, "for exposing the truth. Perhaps that's why your ratings are so much better than your untruthful competition." And then, minutes later, the president says, "The Democrats are pushing for universal health care while thousands of people are marching in the UK because their system is going broke and not working. The Democrats want to raise taxes greatly for really bad and non-personal medical care. No thanks." And that's why what I had to say this morning on Fox and Friends became a really big story. So let's get one thing straight. Most people in America would not want the UK system, though the Democrats are toying with universal health care. And I'm pretty certain that virtually everybody in the United Kingdom would not want the American health system. One, because, of course, there is not free health care, although Obamacare did do something for that. But the real problem is this. American health care, whichever way you do it, is massively more expensive than UK health care. And the reason for that is they have such a litigious system in America. People who sue on medical claims, if they win, get awarded vast sums of money. I do fear we're perhaps going ever so slightly in that direction. So I'm not really asking you your views on what Donald Trump thinks on the NHS, because that isn't frankly relevant. He's seen a problem in the NHS, and that is part of his argument for not having state healthcare in the USA. Now, the real debate is, am I right or am I wrong when I say that I think our NHS is at breaking point? And I say it, and there are lots and lots of examples, but just one little example. A friend of mine who works manually has had a real problem, physical problem with his foot. He's been waiting 6 months for a scan, and that's someone that needs to be as fit and able as they possibly can be. By any measure, our health service this winter is in crisis. And I want to know, tell me, am I right, am I wrong about the NHS with where it is today? And please, please, if you work in the NHS, do give me your personal experience of what it's now like to work within that service. And you can do that by calling 0345 6060 973. And perhaps you've been a patient recently, or maybe you've got a relative in hospital now. Tell me how that's working out right now. And you can do that by texting to 84850. And maybe you think this service needs praise and should never be criticised, in which case you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And by the way, I'm not campaigning to get rid of the health service, but I do think it's going to need some pretty radical reform, given all the demographic changes in our country. Jim is calling from Tiverton in Devon. He's our first caller this evening. Hello, Jim.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm lucky. I'm well. I'm not waiting for an operation, Jim. I'm not waiting for a scan. And, Jim, I'm one of the 10%. I'm one of the lucky 10% who's got private health care. So Jim, given that I've had car crashes, plane crashes, cancer, and goodness knows what else, I know a lot about the health system.
Yes, indeed. I'm sure you do, Nigel. And I'm sure there are lots of people listening tonight that have the same experience of the health system, some good, some bad. I think everybody would agree that nurses and doctors in this country do a brilliant job. I think nobody would disagree with that. But what I would say is I think there are some fundamental problems with the health service. And I think the government know what those problems are and they could fix them. And I think there's a couple of areas, if I may say so. I think the first area is that we've had years and years of employing foreign nurses into the health service, and they've done a very good job. Those people that have come from all over the world to work there. But when you talk to those nurses, now a couple of my friends are nurses, a couple of them from the Philippines, they will tell you straight that the reason they work here is because the pound they earn in UK is worth 7 times the spending power in their own country. So in actual fact, when our nurses are on low wages that they can hardly live on, these girls tend to send money home and do very well from it. And that's the main reason that they come here.
And that's an argument, Jim, that's an argument, Jim, of course, that applies to agriculture and many, many other areas. Is there a problem? I mean, do you think we're just simply not training enough of our own nurses and doctors?
Oh, no, absolutely. My job in previous life was as a trainer, and you get in you get out what you put in. I think it's ridiculous that we ask nurses to pay for their training. I think that if we made it a more attractive career, and God knows I don't think it is at the moment, because the hours they work and the conditions they have to put up with, I think, are ridiculous. But we should train our own nurses, and in the long term, when you train people properly, you have well-trained people, you benefit in the long term. So that's the first thing. The other thing is we've got to stop the monopolies that the pharmacies have. The pharmaceutical companies have a huge monopoly. Single sourcing in the NHS is prevalent, and there are drugs that should cost us $15 that cost us $1,500 a pop. Yeah, and that is ridiculous. That is
Jim, this is absolutely right. I'm making the argument about the population crisis, about the massively increased demand. The counter-argument that comes is just throw more money at it. But you need to know, Jim, don't you, that money is being well spent.
Absolutely, and I do agree with you, Nigel, that the other one is we do treat people that are not entitled to the NHS from abroad, because we're that type of country that does that, but it is being abused. And once again, ministers bleat on about it and say, well, it's a minority amount of people. It doesn't matter. One too many is one too many, and that money could be better spent on people who are waiting for operations. It's not fair.
No, Jim, thank you for your call. I agree with you, and Jim making the point about health tourism, which is costing about £2 billion every single year. Let's get a view from Mark in Eltham. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening. 2 things I'd like to question and hope that I get told something or eventually with other people ringing in. I've never quite understood why we constantly hear we have the best health service in the world. I'm not saying it isn't pretty good. In fact, I think it's very good. It's done me proud. But why hasn't any other country gone down that road completely? As my understanding is, no other country has. And secondly, I think that we are lunatic to say it's got to be free at the point of entry for everybody. I haven't agreed with that for a long, long time. I can understand that you have to have a system where people can't afford, well, then they have to be subsidised for it. But any going to your GP, we should pay a small fee. If you go to A&E on your own account, you should pay a fee bigger than to your GP. And if you're in the hospital, there should be a fee to a certain extent.
Yeah,
I just don't understand why nobody
Mark,
will.
I think the answer is quite simple, Mark. That this was established back in 1948. It was part of Clement Attlee's big promise to the public at the end of World War II. There was going to be a new welfare state, and the NHS was absolutely the centrepiece of this. And the model that was set up, the 1948 model, was that it would be free at the point of use, and it was a uniquely British way of doing it. And I think the truth of it, Mark, is that model hasn't changed very much. Yeah, we've seen outsourcing and PFIs and various experiments, nearly all of which appear to have gone wrong, actually. But I think we're stuck with an outdated model in many ways. But, Mark, it's a model that the British people believe in. And this is the point. You know, it's rather like if you give a dog a bone, it's easy to give a dog a bone, but it's very hard to take it back. And I think I'm right in saying, Mark, and bear in mind we live in a democracy, so the will of the people has to be supreme. My impression is that right now, the majority of the British population don't want the basic model changed, but would love to see other reforms.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is it true to say that from 1948, the NHS has overspent its budget every single year since?
Well, I think it's bound. Yeah. Well, I think it's bound to in many ways.
We're not running a very efficient system.
No, I mean, Mark, it's bound to in many ways. There are lots and lots of factors that have put a huge increase on that health service, and I'm going to discuss those. And I'm going to discuss also the whole question of procurement of drugs and medicines in a moment. But for now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15.
Knife and gun crime.
If we want a better national health service, we're going to have to be honest about the problems that it's suffering from. Drug procurement. John from Market Drayton says another problem is the NHS is paying 1,500 quid off for a tub of moisturiser that can be bought for £2 from a supermarket. Deplorable. No more money to the NHS until they get their own house in shape. Well, is John from Market Drayton right? Well, according to The Times very recently, he's absolutely right that the NHS did pay £1,500 for a tub of skin cream that could be purchased on the high street for £2. £650 was paid for a customised tub of coconut oil that could have been bought for £1 on the high street. And Concordia, the Canadian drug company supplying drugs to the NHS, had been found to have overcharged by £100 million over the course of the last few years. So there are some massive problems here with how the money is actually being spent. I think there are many that will look to outsourcing and say that perhaps is one of its major problems. And many other problems too. You know, I talked a moment ago about the 1948 model and where we are today. Mark in Elton was asking that question. Well, one thing, life expectancy is now 13 years longer on average than it was back in 1948, and there's a whole host of operations like hip replacements that didn't even exist, weren't possible to be done back in 1948. But I absolutely insist that the biggest problem is that over the course of the last 20 years, we have had an unprecedented level of immigration into this country, roughly running at 10 times the number that it did for the previous 60 years. And those that were happy in the Labour and Tory parties to allow these huge influxes into the UK never really made any infrastructure provision for the population going through the roof. One little example of this, perhaps, is there's been a 40% increase in the use of accident and emergency over the course of the last 13 years. Yes, other factors, doctors not home visits as much as they used to, etc. But a 40% increase in those going to A&E over the course of the last 13 years. The NHS has got some massive, serious problems. That's my view. I wonder what Andrew in Islington, a new caller to the show, thinks. Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, but I mean, tell me I'm wrong, Andrew. Tell me everything's fine.
Well, first of all, I'm going to be very quick. I completely support you on Brexit, and by no means am I a lefty loony or anything of that sort. Now, as far as the NHS goes, we have a lot of problems, and immigration, I'm sure you're completely right, has played a massive part in it, given that it's open to everyone, and everyone can come in and take advantage of it. And as far as Donald Trump tweeting about it, I'm not sure how much he does know or doesn't know about the history of it or anything like that. But I would just take that with a pinch of salt, because I know the Americans, especially the Democrats, look at our model and think of it as, you know, the golden egg of how we could solve medical care. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's right. I think there are those within the Democrats who look at the NHS and say, why can't we do it here? But they realise it doesn't really carry public support in America. And also, Andrew, they've got this massive problem in the States that all healthcare is just so hugely expensive because of litigation.
Nigel, before I go, I just want to make one more quick point.
Yeah.
I know you've been very critical of Theresa May. Do you also criticise her when she has abandoned the vote for MPs to lift the barbaric act of fox hunting, which I know you're involved in? You know. And
what about I'm involved in? I've never ridden to hounds or jumped over a...
You've had pictures of you with drinks where they do the ritual and, you know, they put the blood over the youngest kid there.
No, Andrew. Fox hunting was abolished 10 years ago. Those Boxing Day meets that I attend, and as I have done since the 1960s, are people going off drag hunting, all right? So they're not even hunting foxes. Theresa May, you know, we live in an urbanised society. Fox hunting is not popular. It's a minority sport. I accept that, Andrew. I just take the general view that government should butt out and people make their own minds up. But listen, thank you for your call. Sarah in High Wycombe says, even if someone comes to the UK and pays tax, how long will it take for their tax contributions to pay for the NHS, schooling, houses, etc.? Well, Sarah, that's an argument I've been putting out there for the last 6-7 years, and I've been roundly abused for making it. So I suggest, Sarah from High Wycombe, you're careful who you put that argument to, because people don't like it. On Twitter, I agree with the previous caller, a small fee for a visit to the GP and a hospital. Free things get abused. Well, there was actually a proposal a couple of years ago. Lord Winston was involved with this, saying that people should pay to go and see their GP, or at least, as happens in this country that I'm in now, France, they should pay a deposit to go and see their GP, so that if they don't turn up, they forfeit the money. And yet, whenever ideas like that get proposed, my feeling, and again I could be wrong, but my feeling is overwhelmingly people at the moment appear to be against it. What I do know, says Paul on Twitter, is I'd rather be sick in the UK or Europe than in America. Paul, that depends what insurance you've got, but I completely get the point. Luke is calling from Newquay, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Luke.
Hi, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm fine. So what do you think?
Well, I was wondering why, when you seem to be aware that, you know, there are lots of issues that have blighted the NHS, like PFI, like pharmaceutical companies charging exuberant amounts, why you decide to go on American television and single out this one relatively small in financial terms issue around immigration and health tourism.
No, Luke, it's not small. It is the issue. You know, our population is rising by 500,000 people every single year. This is something that no government in the last 20 years made any provision for whatsoever. And Luke, I agree with you. PFI has been a disaster, and some of us actually predicted that nearly 20 years ago. Clearly, procurement has gone crazily wrong. Clearly, health tourism is a burden. I would agree with all of those things. But Luke, I'm going to argue with you that the single biggest problem the NHS has got is that demand now massively outstrips supply.
But can you back that up in financial terms? Would you say financially the burden is immigration? Or
well, that's a slightly separate argument, although I would say this to you, Luke. When people tell you, oh, no, Nigel, you're wrong, because low-paid or relatively low-paid migrants that have come to Britain have worked and paid their taxes, so therefore they're a benefit to the economy. Well, fine, but if the population increases by millions, as it's done over the course of 20 years, you do need more roads, more hospitals, more schools, and none of that's ever been priced in. But I'm not coming at this directly from finances. The point I'm making is we clearly, if the NHS, Luke, is going to go on as it is, it's clearly going to need actually massively more money under this model, or it's going to break.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on that.
You know, it's going to break. So, I mean, what is healthcare in Cornwall like? Pretty good, I would think.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah, I can get seen at my GP pretty quickly. They do a thing here which is good, where they'll get the GP to call you back and find out if what you're coming in for is really worth coming in for, rather than just having a quick conversation on the phone, which I think is good. You know, that's a smart little innovation that I think probably saves them a bit of time.
Yeah, I mean, the population in Cornwall, Luke, has gone up, but nothing like it has in some other parts of the country. In other parts of the country, people try and get a GP appointment, it might take them a fortnight.
Yeah, but I think you went on American television to tell them that because it's core to your personal brand, that they know they'll get you on and you'll talk about immigration, when actually you're well aware that there are, you know, far more serious issues facing the NHS, and I wish you'd talk about them. You'd share them.
Luke, I will. I promise you. I will go into more of them over the course of the next hour. Let me just say this to you, Luke. And by the way, thank you for calling the show, new caller. Let me just say this to you, Luke. Nothing I said on Fox News this morning have I not said in the last few months here on LBC. I thank you very much indeed for your call. The NHS, just like everything else the government has its hand in, is inefficient and full of bureaucracy. It needs to be privatised and let the open free market provide healthcare. Well, there may be an economic argument for that, but there is not a political or social argument for that, and it's not what people want. I think it was Nigel Lawson that once said that the NHS was the nearest thing we have to an organised state religion. I wonder what Bill in Milton Keynes thinks of this debate. Good evening, Bill, and another new caller.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. I hope I can make sense.
We all do, Bill. We all do.
Yeah. The NHS is not free, and this is my bugbear. I mean, I worked in the NHS for 30 years.
Yep.
The NHS is not free. We pay for it through taxes and national insurance. The thing is, it's only free if you come into this country and turn up at A&E. And to my mind, the only people that should have access to the NHS is the people that pay the taxes.
What about those that are unemployed then, Bill?
If they're unemployed and they're British, then their parents will have paid the taxes. Okay. Or they might have paid taxes up to the time they were unemployed. Okay. But at least they paid something. They haven't just got off a boat and turned up at A&E.
Bill, do you ever thought, and I sort of hinted this earlier, and indeed on Fox News, that actually, going back a few decades, we were generally pretty happy with the NHS?
Until around about 2007, between 2007 and 2009, that's when the problems really started, when the doors were opened.
OK, Bill, I thank you for your call. I think it may have started a bit earlier than that, but hey. Hi, Nigel. The government have sunk millions upon millions into the health service. No, they haven't. They've sunk billions upon billions, like £140 billion this year we're going to spend. You don't need a calculator to work out that this country is overpopulated. From 1947 until the late 80s, we had a great NHS. Until we get our huge immigration problem sorted, things will get a hell of a lot worse, says Frank in Essex. Look, I'm not blaming immigration for the entire problem, but I do think a rocketing population is the biggest problem our National Health Service faces. I really, genuinely, 100% believe that. Hey, come and tell me I'm wrong. For now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:30. I said earlier on today, our NHS is in deep crisis. It is at breaking point. Demand is now massively exceeding supply, a point the US president picked up on. But let's not compare our health system with the American one, because they really are chalk and cheese. But tell me, am I right or wrong about the problems our health service has got and what can be done to make it better? Meanwhile, in London today, Monsieur Barnier, Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was in town. And he said that the decision of the UK to leave the EU's customs union will cause unavoidable barriers to trade. Barnier said, without a customs union and outside the single market, barriers to trade in goods and services are unavoidable. Mr Davis, in response, who, by the way, in the pictures did not look a happy bunny, in my opinion, said the talks had been very constructive and the next round would focus on the implementation period. That's government speak for the transition period. An intense period of negotiations will begin straight away, and the government is confident of securing an agreement at the next meeting of EU leaders in March, he said. So the big meeting takes place in Brussels on the 22nd, 23rd of March, and that's when everyone round the table is going to talk about trade. Basically, Barnier doing what we expected, not applying the economic logic that the UK is a fantastic marketplace for EU exporters to the tune of an €80 billion surplus every single year. No, Barnier playing politics. He doesn't want it to be seen that we've left the European Union easily. Otherwise, he knows Denmark and Austria and goodness knows who else would want to follow us, and possibly in quite short order. I've said before, I'll say it again, we need to be lobbying the German car makers, the Belgian chocolate manufacturers. We need to be lobbying the people who may well get tariffs put upon them. And this is quite a big part of the debate that's going on in Italy at the moment, ahead of their general election taking place in early March. But another idea was put to me today that could just be a winner. If the French farmers and French wine producers, for whom we're a really big, important market, if they thought their government was trying to make it more difficult for them to sell their goods to the UK, what would they do? Well, of course, we know what the French farmers and smallholders do. They come to Paris, they protest, they riot, and maybe we should be making sure the French farmers know that their government, Monsieur Macron, is in cahoots with Michel Barnier to try and make their lives very much more difficult. It would be a different approach. You never know, it might just work. Back to the health service and its problems, and Dan in Caterham, a new caller of the show, is on the line. Good evening, Dan.
Good evening, Nigel. It's an absolute honour to talk to you.
Well, that's very sweet of you. So, is the NHS in as much trouble as I think it may be?
I'm just trying to regather my thoughts. You've got me all excited again now talking about Brexit. I was very...
Sorry, I apologise. I tried to make it a Brexit...
Macron, it upset me. I'm going to try and stay calm. So,
I tried, Dan, to make it a Brexit-free zone, but I just couldn't manage it.
Well, and that's the reason I listen to you, because I love the Brexit chat, but I've got a very specific point to make. I'll try and keep it straight to the point.
Okay.
And I don't disagree with your point at all about the demographic, but just listening to your show tonight and listening to a couple of the points on how the money is spent, I just wanted to make a very specific point. I think it could take someone like you, Sir Nigel, to look into this, to shed some light on it, because I work in the recruitment industry. I recruit far nastier people than nurses and teachers, believe me, but I recruit financiers. But I work in that industry and I know a little bit about it, and I can tell you this: it applies to teachers just as much as it does to nurses. But in this case, we're talking about the NHS. The amount of money that specific recruitment companies, private sector recruitment companies, are making in margins, charging NHS trusts for nurses. Probably the average man or woman in the street probably thinks that all these nurses who treat them when they go to the hospital are just on a permanent contract. They've been hired and trained, and and it's a big part of the debate. Where do these guys come from and how much are they paid? Is it enough? Well, I can tell you this. A lot of those nurses are employed on contract. They actually leave their permanent contract because they can get more money on a day rate. And is this what they call supply? Supply nurses? Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So locums, I guess you could say.
Yes.
So basically, when an NHS trust doesn't have the staff, which happens a lot, they call up the agency and say, "Hey, look, we need 3 nurses today down in such and such a hospital," and they then pay way above the odds. I mean, we're talking about big day rates for doctors, nurses, plus a margin that is just pure profit to the recruitment company.
And you guys take out what, Dan? About 20%?
It varies. I mean, look, in my industry, 20 to 25, 30%. I think in some of this type of stuff, it might be a bit lower than that, but certainly 15% plus.
Yeah, Dan, I was told one of the reasons that the supply locums were needed more than before was the imposition of the EU's very rigid working week. And that had finished up with shortages. And, Dan, I was also being told, on authority, that it meant that patients that were in hospital at the weekend were in far greater risk of not getting the right treatment.
Absolutely. I can well believe that. I think that applies to a number of industries, but obviously in this case, what we're talking about is our health, the NHS. It's a scandal. I mean, if only we knew the amount. The reason these guys don't want, and the reason it's so easy for these guys to keep these details sort of under the radar, is that this doesn't go down as their head count. They put it through their accounts as some sort of spend. But ultimately, if one were to look into, if there was some way of finding out how much each trust is spending on recruitment companies' profit margins.
Yes, okay. No, I think, Dan, you're onto something there. I've seen little bits and snippets of this over the years. You as an industry expert know what's going on. Great call. Thank you. Nigel, why do you keep saying the NHS is free when we all pay our national insurance? Well, that's how it was sold to us post-war. National insurance would be the bit that went to the health service. But you know what, folks? It doesn't. National Health Service is just another form of tax, and it all goes into one big pot in the middle, and out of that we pay for everything. Now, there is a Liberal Democrat-inspired idea at the moment. We've heard it before, but it's there today, suggesting that we ring-fence part of our taxation for the health service. But if we go down that route of ring-fencing, or hypothecation as it's known, you'll then find schools want the same, everybody else wants the same, and the country would be ungovernable. What we should do, folks, is to abolish national insurance, its extra bureaucracy, and it's a total con, and lump it all together in tax. Simpler, cheaper, better, and we'd stop conning people as to what national insurance really, really is. Vicky is calling from Brighton. Good evening, Vicky.
Hello, good evening, Nigel. The first time I've ever spoken to you. So
you're a new caller, I see that. Yes, welcome.
Indeed, thank you. Before I come to the point I want to make on the NHS, I would like to suggest that I think Monsieur Barnier is getting somewhat windy about things. This is his urgency, because I think if he ever thought the awkward squad got into number 10, a trio of Brexiteers, I think he'd find life much more difficult. So it could just be that he's getting a little bit worried about things, and he thinks he might get a much better deal out of the Prime Minister than somebody who might follow on from her. But
well, that may be true, and certainly before Christmas, it did appear that they were doing all they could. Juncker, Barnier, doing all they could to make sure that Phase 1 got the big tick, so we could move on to trade talks in Phase 2. Although, Vicky, I would say that at 40 billion, I'm not surprised.
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've negotiated contracts in business over the years before I retired. And really, when people keep on about wanting to know what's going on, it's laughable. Of course you don't tell the other side. You don't give them any indication. They'd be lousy at playing poker, wouldn't they? Oh,
yeah, I agree.
Anyway,
I agree. And Vicky, what of the NHS?
Yeah, the point I wanted to make, Nigel, I'm so delighted you do keep on about this numbers issue, because it really, really matters. I campaigned for leave over a long period of time, and what people worried about, they didn't care whether people were black, white, pink or scarlet. That wasn't an issue. It was the numbers issue and all the kind of particular pressure on the NHS. And it makes me so angry when I see these various discussions that go on, and all the time the excuse is the ageing population, mainly the ageing population, and obviously new innovatory operations and everything. Now, part of that is clearly true, but actually the ageing population is getting more healthy. That's why they're living longer. But the other point is that surely it must be possible to do analysis across the NHS and see where all this extra money is needed, because you have all types of treatment in the NHS, obstetrics, you've got so many different paediatrics, everything. this isn't just pressure on one particular part of the NHS, the geriatric end or those.
No, it's a massively increased demand, Vicky, isn't it? At absolutely every single level.
Across the board. So this is why people should be so much more honest. It's not just the ageing population.
But Vicky, when I talk about this,
25% or something.
When I talk about this, when I talk about housing, and if I were to challenge our mainstream political leaders, they don't think increased numbers have anything to do with the problem. They are in denial, unlike you, Vicky in Brighton. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:45. I'm asked by text, did successive governments not commission impact studies on what mass immigration would do to the NHS? If they didn't, they were incompetent, says Mark. Mark, they couldn't, because when you have an open door and you don't know how many are going to come, and your previous guess in 2004 was it'd be 13,000 a year, how can you? No planning for this was done at all, and that is the true capital cost of open door immigration, and we're seeing it. We really are seeing it. I believe that strongly. But if you think I'm completely wrong, it's 0345 6060 973. Brendan is calling from Kingston. Good evening, Brendan. Good evening, Brendan. Right, Brendan. I've lost Brendan. Let's go to Andy instead. Andy, good evening.
Yeah, on Nigel. Good to talk to you. I'll be completely honest to say that I'm not a long-time listener, but I just happened to sort of tune in today. I think it's really important.
I can see you've never called us before. So what is it about this subject that made you pick up the phone, Andy?
Right. I hear some of your callers and some of your messages coming in, particularly the last caller saying that she was fed up with the argument about it being an ageing population being the reason why it's all gone a bit wrong in the NHS. But that is a strong argument because, you've got to bear in mind, and you didn't mention that when you mentioned the figures, that the pension pot is also in national insurance. So we have an ageing population, and in the last sort of 30 or so years that I've been working, the state retirement age has increased by 5 years at a time. So now, you've got to be working until you're 70, when previously it was probably 60. So that in itself, over a longer period of time, when it all comes from the same pot, is a cost we can't deny. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that what you've said, I make you right. The infrastructure hasn't been set up to cope with the increase in population.
That's right.
But I think it's really, really careful. What we don't do is pitch it in a way that suggests that immigration is the root cause of it.
Okay.
I'll give an example, if I may. Right?
Yeah, you do.
If you went to a Chinese buffet and it was eat as much as you like, and you look forward to it all day, and you've got there, and you realise that all your favourite dishes are not available, and the waiter or waitress, I'm really sorry, there's no more coming out. What you're going to start to do is probably look at the people who have already been there ahead of you, and they filled their plates up with your favourite food, and you'll be quite envious or angry the fact that they've helped themselves to a little bit too much. But should you be blaming the patrons of the establishment for having access to it, or should you be blaming the establishment for not doing the planning? And I think it's really important that the blame goes on the planning, because we knew it was coming. I appreciate that we underestimated it slightly, but there's all these things in the mix, ageing population, etc., that the government haven't done all the statistics and got it right and put the investment in it.
Well, Andy, to be fair to me, I did say, I made it very clear at the start, that since this model was established back in 1948, average life expectancy has risen by 13 years. And I also did say, Andy, there's a whole load of operations like hip replacements that simply weren't available back then. So I am not saying, Andy, that the increase in population is all of the problem, but I would argue that it's the biggest part of it.
Can I just correct you there? I wasn't disputing that you had said that. I'm saying some of your callers call up with these sound bites, particularly one who had said around how long will it take for somebody to pay in if they're from overseas, start paying in to be able to take out. You've got to bear in mind that the NHS isn't a variable cost. Once it's set up, you can't just have the building and then say, well, we'll bring in a nurse once we get a patient. There are standard setup costs that will exist whether you have one patient or 100,000 patients. And if you think about it, outside of that cost, if we're paying, I don't know, £2,000 a year in national insurance, surely the amount of times we use the service won't come anywhere close to the increase in cost on it.
Well, I think the point, Andy, is... I think the point, Andy, is that health tourism is estimated to cost about 2 billion sterling every year. And whilst we're spending 140 billion, so you can argue in percentage terms it's not massive, it does, Andy, make people angry, doesn't it?
it does make people angry, but what we need to be angry at is that, hospitals are top-heavy. And I disagree. My wife's a nurse, and I disagree with your previous caller about recruitment. Yeah, she works incredibly hard, and I think the thing is, when she went into it, and she works in a London hospital, there are no agencies supplying their staff. It is supplied by people who work for the hospitals, who are going into other schemes, but not run by agencies.
Well,
that do bump up their pay.
Yeah. Doesn't this depend which health trust it is, Andy? I think. But, I mean, look, Andy, I get the point. It's got a whole wide range of problems. I thank you, first-time caller to LBC, for calling in. Loads of messages. It's not working as it should be, but we already know that. The US does not have the answer on this issue, says Dr. Tony. Tony, I wasn't arguing that it did. Our International Health Service is failing due to an ever-increasing population, the same as housing, says Craig. Nigel, I worked in the NHS for a long time. Money is wasted, mismanaged. I'd get rid of the agency staff, nursing and medical. This is costing millions to the NHS. These staff have to join the NHS. I know it's some of my colleagues in the community who have been on the agency for many, many years, and this now needs to stop, says Anna. It's costing too much money. A view that we've heard actually tonight from somebody who is, a recruitment consultant. Shreya is calling from Edgware. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm very well, and welcome to the show. Another new caller. Welcome. What's your take on this?
Well, I think some of the points that have been pointed out, like in terms of where we're losing money, they seem to be really negligible compared to where we actually are losing money. So I've got my experience in finance and health informatics, and really it's understanding the infrastructure of how a trust is run, how the NHS is run, where the data flows. And in any kind of reporting or any kind of decision we make, we need to actually look into the actual structure and infrastructure of it, because we can hypothesize on a lot of things like like your previous caller, I agree with what he had to say. It's actually a really small impact on where the money is going out from, like in terms of recruitment of nursing. That's nothing compared to how much the pharmaceutical industry is leaching out of the NHS. So we're talking about £20 billion a year. Yeah. And remember, it's not like all of that drug is actually being effective, because our death rates are increasing. So those drugs are not necessarily effective. Also, if you go to a lot of these patients' homes, you'll see bags and bags of drugs just sitting there. They're not being used. There's no measure on how effective those drugs are on the patient, but they're still being prescribed overall over years and years and years and years, but they're not being, they're literally just wasted. And there's no,
and isn't it true that people get on prescription drugs and often stay on them for years and years and years, quite unnecessarily in some cases?
Absolutely, like vitamin drugs. I mean, they don't even get used, and that's just one aspect. We're talking about £20 billion at least a year. £2 billion is nothing if we're talking about figures from, people. There's also a unit. There's actually a unit within a trust, or a lot of the trusts, whereby they actually go back to the country and try and recoup that money that was spent. So there's actually a process in which they try and get the money back.
And they fail. They fail time and again. Shreya, I do understand your point that there's some really big issues here around costs of the pharmaceutical industry and our attitude towards prescription. But I would say, a billion here, a billion here, a billion there, and soon we're talking real money. But I do get your point, and this point about drugs, the cost of drugs, procurement, overprescription, it's a big one. And I thank you. Genevieve is my next caller from Chelmsford. Good evening, Genevieve.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So, are we in a mess with our NHS?
No, not as much as a mess as we are in the US. I saw a little bit of what you have to see on Trump's network earlier.
Trump's network. Well, it's not CNN, is it? Go on, yeah.
Well, yeah, CNN is better, but okay, I digress. So, as an American living here, I live here, I pay taxes, 40%, pay towards the NHS. So I'm an immigrant in a sense. So I pay towards, there's a lot of talk about immigrants. I'm a part of that immigrant group, which gets bashed all the time. But in terms of the differences with the two, $600 is what it goes up to when you privatize, but let's say for an EpiPen. My son is asthmatic. That's what it went up to at one point in the US.
So, Genevieve, I'm running out of time. Can I just ask you quickly, you'd prefer the health system here to America, yeah?
Definitely.
And I think almost everybody would. Anyway, I'm out of time. I'm really sorry. I'd love to have done more on that. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow at 7. At 10 o'clock tonight, it's Ian Collins. But up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.